a substantial number of them and ministers now believe that unless they change their leader, Labour has absolutely no chance of winning the next general election.
Why does Britain keep losing its Prime Minister?
Tristan, that is a question that we here on this side of the Atlantic, even we've heard about it. You all seem to cycle through so many prime ministers, and we may not know much about the British political system, but we've seen, 6 prime ministers in the last decade since Brexit? It's a lot.
Well, Asma, you're absolutely right. And it may be that the most stable political operator in the UK for the last decade has been a cat called Larry, who lives at 10 Downing Street, because he has seen prime ministers come and go, and very soon he may see a new one arrive at Downing Street.
Indeed, I've been reading and hearing that the current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, looks like he is under enormous pressure from members of his own party who could be trying to kick him out.
Right, and that is exactly what we're going to be getting into today. From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redmond in London.
And I'm Asma Khalid in Washington, D.C. And welcome to The Global Story on YouTube.
Well, my name is James Landale. I am the diplomatic correspondent for BBC News, which means I sort of cover global affairs. But in my deep hidden past, I was also a political correspondent and deputy political editor of the BBC. So I spent a large amount of my life skulking in the corridors of Westminster.
Well, James, I will say, from this side of the Atlantic, what I do know about British politics in this moment, one major headline that has crossed the ocean is that it seems like you all are in a bit of turmoil. But I want to understand from you how he got into such a shaky position, because it felt like he won this landslide victory. What was this, just less than 2 years ago? How is he now in such a fragile position, it seems?
I think the first thing to understand is that although Sir Keir Starmer won a massive majority in the House of Commons, as you say, 2 years ago. It was about 165 seats, and it's a genuinely enormous majority. It's a bigger majority than was won by Britain's post-war Labour leader, Clement Attlee, and he's the guy who transformed modern Britain, inventing, helped forging the creation of the NATO military alliance, setting up our own national health service, nationalising all our key industries and things like that. Keir Starmer has a bigger parliamentary majority than him. And yet it was described as a kind of loveless landslide. And that's because although he won a lot of seats in the House of Commons, the actual share of the votes cast was actually not that big. It was only sort of 34% or so. And that was really, really low. In other words, because of the vagaries of British politics, it meant that although he got a lot of seats, not that many people actually voted for him in absolute terms. So the basis of his premiership and his government had a slightly sort of heartless feel to it. Since then, various things have happened. He's basically been seen to govern not very well domestically. Foreign, okay. People broadly think that he's done okay dealing with the United States, dealing with European allies, negotiating the Ukraine war and things like that. But domestically, he's been criticised for a variety of reasons.
Well, James, we'll get maybe into some of the tactical reasons for this loveless landslide, as you put it. But if you zoom out to a kind of more strategic level, the last decade of British politics has been overshadowed but maybe by one thing in particular, which is 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago now, there was the famous Brexit referendum result, which led to Britain leaving the European Union. How did Brexit become a turning point for British politics? Because things have been different ever since in many ways, haven't they?
It was 48-52%. There was a clear result. But the country was clearly divided. But it also was an issue about national identity and how you saw your place in the world. Did you see yourself as somebody who felt threatened by globalization? somebody who felt alienated from Brussels and from London and from politicians who you felt weren't reflecting your views? Or did you see yourself as somebody who was internationalist, that Britain had a role in the world, and it was self-evident that it should remain part of this massive trading bloc right on its border? And so what it meant is that people came out of the Brexit result slightly confused about precisely what it meant. And though what it also did, though, is it gave an awful lot of wind to politicians who gathered together people who were concerned about, who felt threatened, alienated by globalization, threatened by immigration and things like that. And they, a lot of them subsequently went on to support a party called UKIP that was led by Nigel Farage. And that party, the latest version of that kind of party, is still led by Nigel Farage. It's currently called Reform UK, and that is, Reform UK and Nigel Farage are now, leading players in mainstream British politics.
Okay.
Anyway, divisive at the time around the debate and the referendum itself. Then came something else, and that was the process of implementing Brexit. And that was supposed to be implemented by the Conservative government that had, held this referendum. But nobody had really agreed how. What should the nature of the relationship between the UK and the EU be going forward? So initially, obviously, we had David Cameron was the Conservative Prime Minister whose policy was to hold the referendum. He lost the referendum, so he felt he had to resign. He was replaced by Theresa May.
Okay, 2, I'm counting.
Then she lost her job a few years later because of her failure to implement Brexit. She was then replaced by Boris Johnson.
Okay, 3.
He was then briefly replaced by Liz Truss.
Okay, 4.
That did not last well because she picked a fight with the bond markets because she promised to cut taxes without saying where the money was going to come from. So she lasted literally a matter of days. And then she was replaced by Rishi Sunak.
Okay, 5.
It created a poison in the political system of constant rebellion, constant turmoil, Conservative MPs thinking it's perfectly acceptable to constantly undermine your Prime Minister and then eventually get rid of them. And then that was obviously until 2024 when the Conservatives lost power and Labour were brought in.
And Labour is the centre-left party.
Labour, left of centre, are sort of, liberal with a small L party. And so, because what we're seeing now is Labour MPs behaving in a similar way to Conservative MPs. In other words, they are 2 years after a substantial election victory, undermining and challenging the leadership of their Prime Minister.
So you had 5 Prime Ministers across 7 years, and all of those PMs that you initially had after Brexit were Conservatives, correct? And then you get to the election of Keir Starmer. Why did he win, and what was he promising? And did his victory at the time tell you something about the desire for stability in that ecosystem of a post-Brexit world in the UK?
Yeah, no, I think at that stage, I think many voters were unhappy with the degree of instability and chaos that the Conservative governments they saw had created. And Labour's pitch, the pitch of Sir Keir Starmer, was that, we will bring a degree of normality. We will bring some calm, some stability, some sort of grown-up adult politics. And so that was the pitch. But that is a pitch that I think in the eyes of voters, Labour has failed to produce, that actually it hasn't delivered stability. It hasn't delivered economic growth. It has shot itself in the foot with self-imposed errors and has got itself caught up in a different kind of psychodrama, and that has led to some incredibly bad opinion poll numbers and a real visceral dislike of Sir Keir Starmer by many voters.
Well, Brexit told Britain a certain amount about what it didn't want, and that was to to not be in the European Union. But it also told us something about what Britons did want, and that was greater control of borders and greater control of immigration. That was one of the central themes of that campaign that led to that referendum decision. And that issue hasn't gone away. It's only grown since then. It's still a major issue in politics in Britain, as it is across Europe and in the United States. What is Keir Starmer offering on the question of control of borders and control of immigration?
Well, the great irony is that net migration in the UK is actually falling at the moment, quite substantially. A couple of years ago, net migration just soared up to around 900,000 people a year, which is an astonishing number. Then in 2024, it dropped, it was halved, it went down to about sort of 400,000. But at the moment, the numbers are actually pointing in the right direction. But for some reason, the current government doesn't manage to bang that drum very well.
What is the narrative around his government and how is that developed? Because a narrative around a government can either make you or break you as a politician. What's the story that his government has engendered?
The Labour government has essentially said, look, we are going to be competent. We are going to manage the economy in a way that the Conservatives failed to. They said growth was their number one priority in all their election campaign, and yet they failed to deliver it. And in part because growth and productivity is proving really, really hard to generate in the UK at the moment. That is something that is a legacy of the financial crash in 2008. And since then, we have seen huge amounts of borrowing in the UK. Then COVID came along and we had to borrow an awful lot of money just keeping the British economy going, paying people, paying salaries, all of that. And we, as a result, have a huge amount of debt. So, for example, we spend more in the UK on paying debt interest, government debt interest, than we do on defence. You know, by a margin of 40, 50 billion pounds sterling. You know, so that's what, 70, 80 billion dollars. That's a huge amount of money. In the past, whenever governments had trouble, they'd spend a bit of cash on it. So if you were a government of the right, you would cut some taxes. If you were a government of the left, you would spend some more on welfare to help the lowest paid. This government cannot do either of those things. And so there's an expectation gap.
And what is the number one concern for British voters as we're talking today? What do polls suggest about that?
It is the cost of living crisis. It is the fact that real household incomes has not risen for years. People are really struggling. And even if you are in work, people are not seeing their pay go up, and yet inflation is obviously still there. The sheer scale of welfare and the fact that there are so many people who are basically claiming welfare and are not being productive workers in the system, paying taxes, that in itself is a huge structural problem that no government has struggled. And this one came into power saying we're going to try and do something. They haven't done it yet.
Okay, so this cost of living crisis you describe, James, it's been going on for some time, right? And I will say that I don't think the UK is unique or alone in feeling those economic pressures. A number of countries, here in the United States, people have had qualms about inflation, about the cost of living for some time. But it seems like the pressure on Starmer to resign has been growing recently since the UK held some local elections earlier this month. Why now? Why are these calls growing louder?
So our local elections, which happened just a few weeks ago, they're sort of our midterms, if you like. They're obviously it's not a direct parallel, but essentially a big test of government popularity between general or presidential elections.
It is quite rare that these local elections make international news, though it does seem to be happening right now.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. Local elections, they're not seen as existential, whereas I think these ones were. And they were existential because basically the governing Labour Party were absolutely walloped in them. I mean, absolutely walloped. They lost about 1,500 council seats, which is a huge number.
That's Nigel Farage's party.
Nigel Farage's party, Reform UK, won about 1,500 seats from almost sort of a minuscule amount. If you add up all of the votes cast and you shove it through a computer and you get clever sort of psephologists, election experts to come up with a number, they come up with something they call the PNS, the projected national share, right? And this is essentially saying, look, if the entire country voted today, because it's not the entire country, it's just some bits of it, but if the entire country today voted, the ultimate result was Reform UK, Nigel Farage's party, did best on 26%. The Green Party, very left of centre party, they were on 18%. And then the Conservatives and Labour, the two what we call mainstream parties, they were both on 17% each.
Wait a second. So I understand, James, you're saying the two parties that are what I would describe, maybe in my political terms, the sort of more fringe parties, not the two mainstream parties, they did better in these local elections.
Correct. That is what's happening at the moment, is that the voters in the UK are becoming disillusioned with the two main parties that have largely shared power for decades and decades and decades. And voters are being attracted to the margins, on both sides of the political divide, because of their unhappiness with the mainstream parties. So they're liking sort of more anti-establishment parties, for Reform UK and Green.
Something more radical.
Yeah, something more radical, something that... Now, I mean, the positive would say, these are fresh-thinking parties, they're cutting to the chase, they're being honest, that'd be their pitch. The critic would say, these are more populist-minded parties offering slightly more simple answers to really complicated questions. But at the moment, those two parties are picking up a lot of votes, and particularly they're picking up a lot of votes from Labour.
Well, Nigel Farage's Reform Party is maybe the most familiar of these more radical parties that made some international headlines after these local elections. But what about the Green Party on the left? How do they fit into the picture?
Well, the Green Party traditionally has been, as you might imagine, a party focused on protecting the environment and talking about climate change issues. And it's largely been quite a marginal party, picked up a few MPs here and there in Parliament. What has happened is that it's got a new young leader, Zach Polanski, who is seen as very energetic, charismatic to his supporters. His critics have other adjectives to describe him. He's attracted lots of young voters who look at the mainstream parties and aren't terribly impressed. But also, crucially, the Greens are picking up quite an awful lot of Muslim voters because they are campaigning hard on Gaza. There are a lot of people who support Palestinian rights, who are Muslims, who do not think that the Labour government has done enough to put pressure on the State of Israel.
So essentially they're stealing some of the issues that would traditionally be the terrain of the Labour Party.
Correct. They have stolen those votes from the Labour Party, and the problem, the dilemma for the Labour Party is it's under attack from both left and right.
So, James, can you sort of incrementally help us understand? Keir Starmer had been under pressure, you say. He had been under pressure on the cost of living, the economy, immigration. Then these local elections happen. His party doesn't do well. Help me connect the dots with, okay, his party doesn't do well, to suddenly his own party members wanting him out of power. How does that happen?
The local election results were so bad for Labour that I think a large number of Labour MPs and ministers came to the conclusion that, as a result, Sir Keir Starmer would not be the man to lead the Labour Party into the next general election, which in theory doesn't have to happen for another 3 years. And therefore, some of them, not all of them, some of them said, right, in that case, we need to have a fresh look at the leadership. but it's complicated. And as we sit here today, there is still no formal leadership election. Sir Keir Starmer remains in number 10 Downing Street. He remains Prime Minister, and there is no formal process underway. However, two things have happened. One is that a Labour MP called Wes Streeting, who was the Health Cabinet Secretary, so the most important minister dealing with health, he has resigned from government and the British Cabinet because of his unhappiness with the leadership of Sir Keir Starmer, saying that where there should be vision, there is now a vacuum. The second thing is this. Another contender seen as a possible future leader is a guy called Andy Burnham. He is currently the mayor of Manchester, a big city in the north of England. He wants to be leader one day. He's tried to be leader a couple of times already, but he can't do that because he's not a member of the British House of Parliament. He's a mayor. So he has to somehow become a member. So that requires somebody else, another MP, to give up the seat. Imagine, a member of the House of Representatives basically has to sort of say, right, I'm standing down, I'm resigning, creating a little election for somebody else to come in. So what's happened is that an MP has been found. A guy called Josh Simons, he's announced that he's going to resign from his seat just on the outskirts of Manchester in a place called Wigan. But there is absolutely no guarantee he's going to win this seat. So there's still a huge amount of confusion over what may happen.
Okay.
But the fundamental point is that the Labour MPs, a substantial number of them and ministers now believe that unless they change their leader, Labour has absolutely no chance of winning the next general election in several years' time.
That is fascinating. As somebody who intimately covered the last presidential election and saw how distraught the Democratic Party was and how Democratic voters didn't want Joe Biden to run for re-election. Nonetheless, he ran, and we all know how that story unfolded with eventually him not being at the top of the ticket. But it's a helpful comparison, so thank you very much, James.
I mean, okay, so the United Kingdom has become unexpectedly unstable over the last decade politically with a succession of prime ministers. What are the fundamental reasons for that beyond, people who don't like this party leader or that party leader or that policy or this policy? Is there something more fundamental and structural that is happening that's driving that instability?
Well, we've touched on some of the answers to that. The financial crisis of 2008, Brexit, COVID, Ukraine, Iran. So point one is, it's a pretty difficult time. I think any leadership over the years would have struggled with some of those issues. Then you add into that, and I think this is where you get to the nub of it, a lack of confidence. I think one of the impact of the recent years is people are sitting there thinking what is our role in the world? What are we about here in the UK? We've left the European Union. We're no longer really a bridge to the United States as we used to be. We're not entirely sure what our relationship is with our European partners. And there are people sitting here thinking, okay, what are we actually about? And I think that lack of national confidence, it's bled into the political system. So at the moment, and a lot of analysts would say this, is that British politics and politicians, they're not levelling with the voters. They're not talking about the tough trade-offs that are actually needed to get into the right place. And there are lots of people at the moment trying to work out how do we get back into a space where we can address the problems that need to be addressed, and we can have the argument depending on where you are on the political spectrum. But instead of just saying, we're going to solve the economy by promising more growth, or we're going to, fixing immigration is somehow a panacea for all problems, or whatever it is, actually addressing these things face on. And I think that's where the debate in the UK now is beginning to nudge itself, but we're not there yet. And I think I would struggle to see it emerging during the current leadership tensions that the Labour Party are facing.
Well, James, thank you so much for joining us on the show. We really appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure. I wish I could be more positive.
That's it for The Global Story on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. And if you enjoyed our episode today, then I've got to mention that our show, The Global Story, is also available as an audio podcast. You can find us every weekday on BBC.com or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.